Thank you for tuning in to the special episode of ProPix TV Live Chat with James. We're taking a look at the Air Canada labor disruption that is potentially going to hit the Canadian airline industry in just hours. Yes, the disruption 2025. We will take a deep analysis of the industry-wide impacts and the systemic vulnerabilities. Let's get started, but keep in mind first, folks, that the airline is not yet shut down completely. They have been taking steps to cancel flights already, but not all flights are canceled, leaving a lot of passengers in limbo, not knowing what's going to happen in the next several hours or in the next 24 hours, where some flights are still scheduled as on time. Now, let's take a look at the Canadian aviation sector as it's on the brink of its most significant operational disruption in recent history. At 1 o'clock a.m. Eastern Time on Saturday, August the 16th, in just a few hours from now, approximately 10,000 flight attendants for Air Canada and its leisure subsidiary, Air Canada Rouge, are scheduled to commence a legal strike. This action, led by CUPE, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, follows an 8-month impasse in a collective bargaining process, with the airline responding by issuing a lockout notice and initiating a preemptive phased shutdown of its global network. Now, the core of the dispute centers on two fundamental issues: wages and the definition of compensable work. CUPE, backed by a 99.7% strike mandate from its members, is demanding wage increases to offset inflationary pressures and, critically, full compensation for all hours worked, including ground duties currently performed without pay. Air Canada has countered with what it describes as a comprehensive 38% increase in total compensation over 4 years, an offer the union contends to a real wage cut and fails to adequately address the unpaid work grievance. Now, the scale of the impending disruption is immense. The shutdown is projected to affect approximately 130,000 passengers and ground 500 flights daily, stranding thousands of Canadians overseas. The direct financial impact on Air Canada is estimated to exceed $50 million per day in lost revenue and associated costs. Now, beyond passenger travel, the grounding will cripple Canada's air freight network, as Air Canada Cargo is the nation's largest provider. This will create severe disruptions to critical supply chains, particularly for pharmaceuticals, perishable goods, and just-in-time manufacturing components. Now, the strategic positions of the key stakeholders are starkly defined. Air Canada is actively pursuing government-directed binding arbitration as the only viable path to a resolution, a move CUPE vehemently opposes as an infringement on the right to free collective bargaining. The federal government has so far maintained a position of encouraging a negotiated settlement while its mediators remain engaged, though it faces mounting pressure to intervene as the economic consequences of the shutdown escalate. This report provides a detailed analysis of the anatomy of the labor dispute, the operational mechanics of the shutdown, and the profound impact on travelers and their legal rights, the ripple effects across Canadian airline industry, and the critical disruption to the national supply chain. It concludes with a strategic outlook and actionable recommendations for corporate travel managers, logistics planners, and government policymakers navigating this complex and damaging crisis. Now, let's move on to the impasse. Yes, the anatomy of the Air Canada CUPE labor dispute. The current standoff between Air Canada and its flight attendants is the culmination of nearly a year of failed negotiations rooted in fundamentally different perspectives on compensation, the value of labor, and the process of collective bargaining. The chasm between the parties, now manifesting as a full-scale work stoppage, is defined by the union's fight against what it terms poverty wages and the systemic issue of unpaid work, and the airline's position that it has tabled a fair and comprehensive offer in the face of unsustainable union demands. Now, when we look at the union's position, they claim, as I said, a fight against poverty wages and unpaid work. Yes, CUPE has anchored its position in two core grievances that have resonated powerfully within its membership, resulting in an extraordinary 99.7% strike mandate, a clear signal of deep-seated and unified dissatisfaction. Now, the most potent and emotionally charged issue is that of unpaid labor. CUPE argues that flight attendants perform on average 35 hours of uncompensated work per month. This includes critical pre-flight safety and security checks, managing the boarding and deplaning of hundreds of passengers, and responding to on-the-ground emergencies, all duties performed before the aircraft doors close and the period of paid block time begins. The union frames this long-standing industry practice as an exploitative status quo and form historical abuse that it's determined to end. The prevalence of protest signs with slogans like "unpaid work won't fly" at member demonstrations underscores that this is not a peripheral issue, but a central pillar to their fight. Alongside the demand for full pay for all hours worked, the union is seeking significant wage increases. They contend that Air Canada offers are just insufficient to counteract the effects of inflation. Since the previous contract was signed in 2015, a period during which flight attendants experienced an estimated 9% erosion in their real wages. According to CUPE's analysis, the airline's proposed 8% wage increase in the first year of the contract does not even cover the past loss, making it a pay cut in real terms. Now, the union further argues that even if the full offer were accepted, an entry-level flight attendant working full-time would still earn less than a federal minimum wage and fall behind the pay scales of competitor airlines in Canada. This deep-seated conviction in the righteousness of their cause informs CUPE's steadfast rejection of Air Canada's proposal for binding arbitration. The union views this as a procedural tactic by the airline to circumvent a genuine negotiation. They argue that an arbitrator bound by precedent would be inclined to uphold the industry status quo on issues like unpaid work, effectively doing the company's dirty work on their behalf. Furthermore, an arbitrated settlement would deny members their democratic right to vote on and ratify their own collective agreement, a principle the union is unwilling to concede. Now, as we switch over and take a look at Air Canada's position, an unsustainable demand versus a comprehensive offer as they describe it. Now, Air Canada's perspective is that the negotiations have reached an impasse due to the union's exorbitant and unsustainable demands, which it contrasts with its own comprehensive and market-leading proposal. The airline has consistently maintained that it has negotiated in good faith for 8 months and has been forced into a shutdown by the union's intransigence. Now, let's take a look here at the centerpiece of the airline's public and negotiating position. Its offer of 38% increase in total compensation over a 4-year period. Air Canada has stressed that this figure is not limited to wages, but represents a holistic package that included a new ground pay formula that significantly enhanced the health benefits and the improvements to pension plans, including a legacy-defined benefit component that is unique among Canadian airlines. The airline asserts that this offer would make its flight attendants the best compensated in the country. Faced with the union's rejection of this offer, its refusal to enter voluntary arbitration, Air Canada has pivoted to a strategy focused on external resolution. The airline has repeatedly and publicly positioned binding arbitration as the only responsible path forward to prevent a catastrophic disruption to travelers, businesses, and the Canadian economy. To this end, the company has formally requested that a federal government intervene under Section 107 of the Canadian Labour Code to impose arbitration, citing government actions in past national transportation disputes as a clear precedent. The airline's decision to unilaterally declare an impasse on August the 12th was a critical turning point. Management justified this by stating the parties remained too far apart on key issues and accused the union of wasting 10 precious days. By refusing to negotiate while it conducted a strike vote, it claimed the union disputes. The declaration set the stage for the subsequent strike and lockout notices and the initiation of the operational shutdown. Now, the chasm between the two sides is more than a disagreement over percentages. It represents a fundamental clash over the very definition of compensable work in the modern airline industry. The union's unwavering focus on eliminating unpaid work is a direct assault on the decades-old industry model of compensating cabin crew primarily for block hours, the time from when the aircraft pushes back from the gate to when it arrives at the destination gate. This model has historically excluded significant periods of on-duty time spent on the ground. Air Canada's offer to introduce a new ground pay formula that compensates for some of these duties, but only at 50% of the standard hourly rate and excluding critical safety and security tasks, is a tactic admission of the legitimacy of the grievance. However, the partial nature of this concession reveals the airline's attempt to contain the financial impact and limit the establishment of a new costly precedent. The union's rejection of this half measure demonstrates that their goal is not merely an incremental gain, but a paradigm shift. Every minute a flight attendant is required to be on the job should be a minute for which they are paid their full rate. This struggle is being closely watched across the continent as similar negotiations over boarding pay are underway at major U.S. airlines. A decisive victory for CUPE at Air Canada would create a powerful new benchmark, potentially reshaping labor cost structures across North American aviation landscape. The context illuminates why Air Canada is so resistant to setting such a precedent and why it strongly favors an arbitration process where a third party is more likely to rely on existing industry norms rather than forge a new standard. Now, as we look at this operational shutdown, it was a calculated unraveling. In anticipation of the strike deadline, Air Canada did not wait for the work stoppage to begin. Instead, it executed a deliberate and highly public phased wind-down of its global operations. This strategy, while presented as a necessary measure for operational stability, also functioned as a powerful tool of leverage in the ongoing dispute, making the consequences of the impasse tangible to the public, the government, and the union days before the strike was legally set to commence. Now let's take a look at this phased wind-down strategy. Yes, Air Canada's leadership made the strategic decision to begin a gradual suspension of its flight operations on Thursday, August the 14th, the full 2 days ahead of the 1:00 a.m. Eastern Time Saturday strike deadline. The publicly stated rationale for this preemptive action was to provide customer certainty and to avoid the logistical chaos that would result from an abrupt unmanaged stoppage. By controlling the shutdown, the airline argued it could better manage the process of notifying passengers, reduce the number of travelers stranded mid-journey, and position its aircraft and crews to allow for a more orderly restart once the dispute is resolved. The wind-down was executed in sequenced manner. It began on Thursday night with the cancellation of several dozen long-haul international flights which carry a significant volume of both passengers and cargo. The pace of cancellations accelerated through Friday, with the airline projecting that a total of 500 flights will likely be called off by the end of the day, impacting over 100,000 customers before the strike had even officially started. The airline's plan culminated in a complete grounding of Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge flights. Now, this was by the strike deadline, of course, of 1:00 Eastern Time on Saturday, August 16th, which we are just hours away from. Throughout this period, the airline's communications consistently and strongly advised customers without a confirmed operating flight to avoid coming to the airport, directing them to online channels for information and rebooking options. Now, this, of course, has created a logistical challenge of a full restart when it happens. Now, the complexity of unwinding a global airline network is matched only by the difficulty of restarting it. Air Canada's Chief Operating Officer, Mark Nasser, has repeatedly emphasized that a full restoration of the airline's schedule, even under the best of circumstances, is expected to take a full week to complete. This extended restart timeline is a function of the airline's vast and intricate operational footprint. It involves the monumental task of repositioning a fleet of over 250 aircraft and their associated flight and cabin crews across a network that spans 200 destinations in more than 65 countries. Aircraft that have been grounded for several days require routine maintenance checks before they can be returned to service, adding another layer of complexity to the process. The orderly wind down by strategically parking aircraft at maintenance hubs is designed to streamline the process, but it remains a significant logistical hurdle that will prolong the disruption for travelers even after a new labor agreement is reached. Now, let's take a look at the scope of the shutdown, the mainline versus express. Yes, it is critical to distinguish what services are affected by the labor dispute. The strike and lockout directly impact all flights operated by Air Canada's mainline fleet and its leisure subsidiary, Air Canada Rouge. These two entities represent the core of the airline's operations and carry the vast majority of its passengers. However, regional services operating under the Air Canada Express brand are not directly affected by the dispute and are scheduled to continue flying. These flights are operated by separate third-party companies, primarily Jazz Aviation and PAL Airlines, whose employees are covered by different collective agreements. While this provides a crucial lifeline for some smaller communities, the capacity at the Express network is limited. These regional partners carry only about 20% of Air Canada's total daily passenger volume, meaning that the shutdown will still remove approximately 80% of the airline's capacity from the Canadian market. The decision to initiate a preemptive shutdown, while operationally sound, cannot be viewed in a vacuum. It represents a calculated strategy in a high-stakes negotiation. By making the disruption a concrete reality for hundreds of thousands of Canadians before the legal strike deadline, Air Canada dramatically increased the public and political pressure on all parties. The images of cancelled flight boards and stories of disrupted travel plans dominate media coverage, shifting the narrative from potential future problem to an immediate national crisis. This front-loading of the strike's pain serves to amplify the calls for a swift resolution, placing the union in the difficult position of being publicly blamed for a disruption that the company physically set in motion. Most importantly, it builds a powerful case for the federal government to intervene, framing such an action as not a choice but a necessary response to an ongoing economic emergency. Now let's turn our direction to the traveler turmoil, navigating the disruption. Yes, the operational shutdown of Canada's largest airline at the height of the summer travel season has unleashed a wave of turmoil and uncertainty for hundreds of thousands of travelers. The direct impact is measured not only in cancelled flights, but also in disrupted vacations, missed business opportunities, and the significant financial and emotional stress placed on individuals and families. Navigating this crisis is further complicated by a contentious debate over passenger rights and the airline's obligations under Canadian law. Now, the scale of the passenger impact. The complete grounding of Air Canada's mainline and Rouge fleets has a staggering daily impact. The airline itself confirms that 130,000 passengers are booked to travel on its services each day, all of whom face disruptions. Now, the figure includes an estimated 25,000 Canadians traveling abroad on any given day, many of whom now face the prospect of being stranded far from home with limited and expensive options for return. The human cost of this disruption is significant. The story of Montreal resident Alex LaRoche, whose $8,000 European vacation with his girlfriend was thrown into jeopardy. It's really emblematic of the thousands of personal stories behind the statistics. After saving since Christmas for the trip, facing the prospect to forfeit or abandoning their non-refundable lodging plans, their other travel itineraries, and other expenses. Now that more than doubles the original price. Now, for last-minute tickets on nearly all competitor airlines, we are seeing a price increase, and that includes WestJet here in Canada, but also with carriers around the globe. These scenarios are being replicated across the country and the globe, affecting family reunions, crucial business travel, and the long-awaited summer holidays. Now, what is Air Canada's official contingency plan for passengers, you may ask? In response to the disruption, Air Canada has publicly outlined a contingency plan with several options for affected travelers. They are offering free changes. A flexible rebooking policy has been enacted. Customers who purchase tickets on or before August the 13th for travel between August the 15th and 19th are permitted to change their flights at no cost. They can rebook for travel on another date between August 21st and September the 12th. This provides an option for those with flexible plans to postpone their trip. Refunds, of course, for any flights canceled by the airline. Passengers are eligible for a full refund, which can be requested through Air Canada's website or mobile app. For those who purchase non-refundable fares and wish to cancel proactively, the value of their ticket can be converted into a credit for future travel, either in an Air Canada wallet or as a future travel credit. Now, there is the option to rebook on other carriers. The airline has stated that it will attempt to rebook passengers on other airlines where possible, including both domestic and international partners. However, this offer comes with a significant caveat. Air Canada has been transparent in warning that available capacity on other carriers is extremely limited due to the peak summer travel season, making the possibility of finding a new flight within an acceptable time frame as low. We look at the passenger rights of the APPR and that controversy that accompanies that. A central point of contention in the crisis revolves around the interpretation of the Canadian Air Passenger Protection Regulations. The classification of the disruptions caused, whether it is within or outside the airline's control, has profound financial implications for both the airline and, of course, its customers. Now, Air Canada's stance: the airline has consistently and publicly classified the labor disruption, including both the strike and its own lockout, as a situation outside of the carrier's control. According to this interpretation of the APPR, the airline's primary obligations are to provide a refund for those unused portion of the ticket or to ensure that the passenger completes their journey on the next available flight on its own service or that of a partner airline. Crucially, under this classification, the airline is not required to provide compensation for inconvenience, including cash payments for delays, or to cover passenger expenses for food, hotels, or other incidentals incurred as a result of the cancellation. Passenger advocate stance is that the interpretation is fiercely contested by air passenger rights advocacy groups. They argue that key actions taken by the airline, specifically the decision to preemptively cancel flights days before the strike began and the decision to lock out its own employees, are business decisions made by management and are therefore squarely within the carrier's control. If this interpretation holds, passengers are entitled to a much higher standard of care and compensation. This includes the right to be rebooked on the next available flight operated by any carrier, including direct competitors, at Air Canada's expense. It also includes mandatory cash compensation for the inconvenience, ranging from $400 Canadian to $1,000 Canadian per passenger, depending on the length of the arrival delay. Advocates like Garber Lukacs, president of the Air Passenger Rights, have issued strong advice to travelers whose primary goal is to reach their destination. do not accept a refund. Accepting a refund can be interpreted as dissolving the contract of carriage, thereby releasing the airline from its legal obligations to arrange and pay for alternate transportation. A passenger who takes a refund is then left to purchase a new, often exorbitantly priced last-minute ticket on their own. The airline strategy appears to exploit this ambiguity with the APPR to transfer financial risks to its customers. By consistently framing the disruption as outside of its control and making the refund option highly visible and accessible, Air Canada effectively minimizes its direct financial liability. This approach circumvents the costly and logistical daunting task of rebooking hundreds of thousands of passengers on competitor airlines during a sold-out travel period. While the legality of this classification for preemptive cancellations and lockouts is debatable and may be challenged in court, its immediate practical effect is to shift the financial burden of the disruption from the corporation to the individual travelers. Now, let's take a look at the capacity constraints and the competitor response. Yes, it's an industry-wide ripple effect. Now, the grounding of Air Canada's fleet is not an isolated event. It's a seismic shock to the entire Canadian aviation ecosystem. The impact is profoundly magnified by the highly concentrated nature of the domestic airline market, creating a massive capacity vacuum that competitor airlines are ill-equipped to fill. This situation not only guarantees travel chaos, but also serves as a stark illustration of the systemic fragility of Canada's air transportation network. Now, let's take a look at the Canadian airline duopoly under stress. Yet again, we look at Canada's airline industry that has long been characterized as a duopoly, with Air Canada and WestJet controlling the vast majority of domestic and transborder air travel. According to analysis from the Fraser Institute, these two carriers account for between half and three-quarters of all air travel at the country's major airports. This market structure means that a significant operational failure at either airline has a disproportionately large impact on the nation's overall connectivity. Now, the complete removal of Air Canada's mainline and Rouge capacity, representing approximately 80% of its daily passenger volume, creates a supply shock that the system is structurally incapable of absorbing, particularly during the peak travel demand of mid-August. Now, let's take a look at the competitor responses and their limitations. The response from other Canadian carriers has been uniform in its message. While they are monitoring the situation, they lack the spare capacity to meaningfully alleviate the disruption. WestJet's response as Air Canada's primary national competitor was that WestJet's of course, the most critical response, and the airline has stated that it is monitoring the situation and will explore opportunities to support Canadians, but it has explicitly added that it has no current plans to adjust its operation or add flights. This is a clear signal that its fleet is already fully deployed to meet the peak summer demand. We also see that Porter Airlines, the rapidly expanding carrier, has reported a noticeable increase in close-in bookings, which it attributes to travelers scrambling for alternatives due to the strike uncertainty. Now, however, like WestJet, Porter has confirmed it's already operating at a full schedule and cannot simply add new flights to meet the surge of demand. Over at Air Transat, the leisure-focused carrier has been directly contacted by Air Canada to assist with the reprotection of some stranded passengers under a pre-existing irregular operations agreement. However, any assistance is strictly subject to seat availability on its already heavily booked flights. The common theme from all competitors, and indeed from Air Canada itself, is the overarching constraint of the summer travel peak season. With aircraft utilization already maximized and load factors high, there is virtually no slack in the system to absorb the 130,000 daily passengers displaced by the shutdown. Now, as you look at the international partners as a partial buffer, for international and transborder travelers, Air Canada membership in the Star Alliance provides a limited but important relief valve. The alliance framework facilitates the reaccommodation of passengers on partner airlines. A key example is the response from United Airlines, one of Air Canada's closest partners. United has issued a travel waiver, allowing eligible passengers ticketed on Air Canada to rebook onto United flights for travel through August 27th without change fees. This will help mitigate the impact for some travelers on the Canada-US routes, but it does not address the massive disruptions within the domestic Canadian market. The immediate and unavoidable consequences of this supply shock is a period of sharp airfare inflation and the few remaining seats available on competing airlines. This is not a matter of opportunistic price gouging, but a standard function of airline revenue management systems which are designed to price inventory based on real-time supply and demand. With supply plummeting and demand remaining high and inelastic, the price for last-minute bookings will without a doubt skyrocket. Travelers have already reported seeing alternate flights priced at more than double that of their original Air Canada tickets. Now, more fundamentally, this event serves as a real-world stress test that exposes the inherent lack of resilience in the Canadian aviation sector. The inability of the market to adapt to the loss of a single major carrier highlights the consequences of long-standing federal policies, such as cabotage rules, which prevent foreign airlines from operating domestic routes within Canada, and, of course, foreign ownership restrictions that limit the entry of new, well-capitalized competitors. The strike, therefore, does more than just disrupt travel. It provides a clear and costly demonstration of the systemic vulnerabilities created by a protected and highly concentrated airline industry. Now let's take a look at the fractured supply chain and the impact of on Air Canada cargo and the national economy, because it's not just passenger travel that's being impacted. While the disruption to passenger travel is the most visible consequence of the Air Canada strike, the shutdown's impact on air freight and national supply chain is equally, if not more severe from an economic standpoint. The grounding of Canada's largest airline effectively serves a vital artery for domestic and international commerce, threatening the flow of critical goods and imposing significant costs on a range of key industries. What is Air Canada's dominant role in cargo? Well, let's take a look. Air Canada's cargo holds a commanding position in the Canadian air freight market, recognized as the country's largest provider by cargo capacity. Its business model is a hybrid one, leveraging the vast belly hold capacity of its global passenger network alongside a dedicated fleet of Boeing 767 freighter aircraft. This combination allows it to offer extensive connectivity to hundreds of destinations, making it an integral part of Canada's component in trade infrastructure. Now, the crippling effect of the passenger fleet grounding, of course, that decision to ground the entire fleet of Air Canada and Air Canada Rouge passenger jets has a devastating effect on the airline's cargo operations. The majority of all air freight is transported in the cargo holds of passenger aircraft, a reality that makes the passenger and cargo business inextricably linked. Now, with this fleet now parked, the primary source of Air Canada's cargo lift capacity has been eliminated overnight. The airline's contingency plan relies solely on its small fleet of dedicated freighters. While these aircraft will continue to fly on a modified schedule, they can only protect an estimated 20 to 25% of the airline's normal capacity for cargo. This represents an immediate and drastic 75 to 80% reduction in the capacity of the nation's largest air cargo carrier. In response, Air Canada Cargo has already been forced to stop accepting new bookings for many of its specialized services, including AC or Air Canada Pharmacare, For temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals, AC for live animals, of course, and that's Air Canada horses, and Air Canada's e-commerce, further constricting the flow of goods. What about the impact on critical industries in the national economy? Well, the sudden removal of so much cargo capacity will have immediate and severe consequences for several key sectors of the Canadian economy that rely on speed and reliability that the air transport provides. Pharmaceuticals may be the most critically vulnerable, and that lies in the pharmaceutical supply chain. Nearly half of all pharmaceuticals shipped by air within and to and from Canada are transported by Air Canada. A prolonged disruption poses a direct threat to the supply of time-sensitive medications, vaccines, and other critical healthcare products, which often require strict temperature controls that air freight is uniquely equipped to provide. When we look at agricultural and perishables, Canada's agriculture sector, particularly exporters of high-value perishable goods like seafood, berries, and fresh produce, will be hit hard. Delays caused by the lack of air freight capacity will lead to spoilage, cancelled orders, and significant financial losses for those producers. When it comes to modern manufacturing, it often relies on just-in-time supply chains where essential parts and machinery are flown in to keep production lines running. The strike will break these delicate chains, leading to delays, potential factory shutdowns, and damage to Canada's reputation as a reliable trading partner. Leading Canadian business organizations have already sounded the alarm about the broader economic damage. The Canadian Chamber of Commerce and the Canadian Federation of Independent Business, as well as the Business Council of Canada, have all issued stark warnings. They state that the shutdown will inflict immediate and extensive harm on an already fragile national economy, disrupt the efforts of businesses trying to diversify their trade relationships, and result in significant losses for Canadian exporters. Now, the financial toll of the work stoppage is substantial. Industry analysts have projected that the direct cost to Air Canada, factoring lost revenue from both passengers and cargo, as well as the costs of refunds and rebooking fees, could exceed $50 million for each day of the shutdown. That is equal to about $40 million US. This figure does not include the wider economic costs, such as the millions in lost revenue for the tourism sector and the unquantified but significant losses incurred by the disruptions to the pharmaceutical, agricultural, and manufacturing supply chains. For historical context, the 13-day pilot strike in 1998 cost Air Canada an estimated $355 million in inflation-adjusted terms, highlighting the severe financial stakes of a prolonged work stoppage. Now, in terms of looking forward and the role of government in the specter of intervention, that is a federal tightrope, and that is that Air Canada's labour dispute has evolved beyond a two-party negotiation into a complex three-party strategic game, with the federal government cast as a pivotal and reluctant third player. The actions and public statements of both Air Canada and CUPE are now aimed at as much at influencing a political decision in Ottawa as they are at pressuring and persuading each other at the bargaining table. The government, for its part, must walk a fine line between respecting the principles of free collective bargaining and preventing a major transportation shutdown from inflicting further damage on the national economy. Now, the government's official stance is that they have adopted a cautious and neutral posture. The Ministry of Jobs and Families, Patty Hajdu, has stated that she is closely monitoring the situation and has publicly encouraged both sides to find a resolution at the bargaining table, further affirming her belief that the best agreements are the ones that parties can reach by themselves. To this end, of course, excuse me, sorry about that, folks. To this end, federal mediators have remained actively engaged with both parties throughout the process, While Minister Hajdu has not commented or committed to direct intervention, she has taken a step of formally asking the union to respond to Air Canada's request for government-imposed arbitration, a move that signals the government's active consideration of its options. What is the legal framework for intervention? Well, the primary tool at the government's disposal is Section 107 of the Canadian Labour Code. Air Canada has formally requested that the minister invoke this section, which grants the government the power to refer an industrial dispute to the Canada Industrial Relations Board, or CIRB, for resolution. Such a referral would immediately suspend the union's right to strike and the company's right to lock out employees. The dispute would then be settled through a process of binding arbitration where the neutral third party would impose the terms of a new collective agreement. This process effectively ends the labor dispute by legislative force, removing it from the hands of the negotiating parties. Now, whether or not the stakeholder strategies are there or not, and let's take a look at what they are regarding intervention. Now, the prospect of government intervention has become a central element in the strategies of both the airline and the union. On Air Canada's behalf, the airline's entire approach appears to be predicated on the high probability of eventual government intervention. By declaring an impasse early, initiating a preemptive shutdown to highlight the immediate economic consequences, and publicly and repeatedly requesting arbitration, Air Canada is systemically building a public and political case for the government to step in. Labor relations experts suggest that this has become a common tactic for employers in federally regulated industries, arguing that the government's history of frequent intervention has created a pernicious effect. That the government history of frequent intervention also diminishes the incentive for management to make difficult concessions at the bargaining table, as they can rely on the government to ultimately force a settlement. And on the other side, conversely, CUPE, the union, is engaged in an intense lobbying effort to prevent government intervention. In formal statements, CUPE has urged Minister Hajdu to reject Air Canada's request and to allow the collective bargaining process to function without interference. The union argues that the mere possibility of intervention has had a chilling effect on the negotiations, allowing the airline to bargain in bad faith with knowledge that it has a government backstop. CUPE has framed potential intervention as an attack on the fundamental Charter of Rights when it comes to its members and the bargaining agreement, or the potential to bargain for a collective agreement. Now, the historical precedent is also important here as we look at the strategic maneuvering that is informed by a long history of federal intervention in major transportation disputes. The government has repeatedly used back-to-work legislation or referrals to the CIRB to end work stoppages at national railways, ports, and at Air Canada itself. In 2011, a strike by 3,800 Air Canada customer service agents was ended under the threat of back-to-work legislation, and in the same year, a potential strike by flight attendants was averted when the government referred that dispute to the CIRB. This history has created a clear expectation on the part of the airline that the government will not tolerate a prolonged shutdown of the national carrier. It has also fostered a deep-seated distrust within the union, which views such interventions as a tool that consistently tips in the scales and favor of management. Now, the current conflict is therefore not just about a single contract. It's a test of whether the current government will continue this historical pattern or allow the collective bargaining process, with all its disruptive potential, to run its course. As the airline work stoppage looks to commence, stakeholders across the Canadian economy must prepare for a period of significant disruption. The final outcome will likely be determined not by a traditional bargaining process, but by political calculation regarding the level of economic pain the country can endure. Based on the current impasse and historical precedent, a strategic outlook can be developed along with actionable recommendations for affected parties. As we look at the scenario analysis, there are three primary scenarios that emerge from the resolution or for the resolution of this process. Scenario 1, a last-minute negotiated settlement, which has a very low probability, especially as we close in on a couple of hours from now. In this scenario, intense pressure from the imminent shutdown forces one or both sides to make a significant concession, leading to a tentative agreement before the disruption becomes prolonged. This would likely require a major shift from Air Canada on the core issues of unpaid work, moving closer to the union's demand for full compensation for all hours worked. Given the deep entrenchment of both sides, this remains the least likely outcome. Now, scenario 2 we look at is the short strike followed by government intervention, which has a very high probability. This is the most probable trajectory, and that is that the strike begins as scheduled, causing immediate and widespread travel chaos and supply chain disruptions. The daily economic cost quickly becomes a major political issue, and within a few days to a week, the federal government, citing severe harm to the national economy, intervenes by either introducing back-to-work legislation or, more likely, using its authority under Section 107 of the Canada Labour Code to refer the dispute to binding arbitration, forcing an end to the work stoppage. Now, the prolonged labor disruption is the third scenario, with a low probability but high impact. In this scenario, the federal government hesitant to interfere in the collective bargaining process or misjudging the political calculus allows the strike to continue for an extended period, and that we define as more than 1 to 2 weeks. This would result in cascading and severe economic consequences, including major damage to the tourism sector, critical breaks in supply chains, and a significant blow to Canada's international trade reputation. While unlikely due to immense political pressure, a long strike would generate, it remains a high impact risk. Now, let's take a look at recommendations for corporate travel and logistics managers. The immediate actions, and that would be all travel and freight shipments booked on Air Canada for the duration of the strike, should be considered cancelled. Activate all available contingency plans immediately. It is critical to advise traveling employees of the rights under the the Air Passenger Protection Regulations, specifically employees whose travel is essentially there and should be instructed to firmly refuse the airline's offer of a refund and instead insist on their rights to be rebooked on the next available flight on any carrier at Air Canada's expense. All interactions with the airline should be documented. Now, in terms of alternative logistics, immediately engage with the alternate air freight carriers and freight forwarders. However, expect a severely constrained capacity and a significant premium price. For domestic and transborder shipments that are not critically time-sensitive, explore expedited ground transportation as viable, albeit slower as an alternative. And again, you can reach out to Carry Movers, one of our sponsors, for West Coast shipments from Vancouver going anywhere across Canada. You can reach Carry Movers at karymovers.com. You can give them a call and talk about the freight that you need moved and express options available to you. Now, of course, immediately engage with alternative air freight carriers and freight forwarders, as I said, but it could be slower and more costly, but again, options are out there. In terms of your long-term strategy, the strike could serve as a catalyst for a comprehensive review of supply chain vulnerabilities. Companies heavily reliant on single air carrier, particularly for just-in-time or high-value goods, must develop more resilient and diversified logistics strategies. This includes establishing relationships with multiple carriers across different transportation modes to build in the redundancy and mitigate the impact of future disruptions, whether they are caused by labor disputes, operational failures, or even geopolitical events. Now, in terms of the government policymakers, what recommendations are there? Well, they can establish a clear intervention criteria to reduce the strategic gaming of the collective bargaining process. The federal government should develop and publicly communicate a clear, transparent framework outlining the specific thresholds of economic or social harm that would trigger federal intervention in a national transportation dispute. This would introduce greater predictability and encourage parties to negotiate more earnestly rather than bargaining with an eye towards eventual government action. They can also review the Canada Labour Code. The frequent use of Section 107 to end transportation strikes has led to credible accusations that it undermines the principles of free collective bargaining. The parliamentary review should be initiated to assess the long-term impact of this provision and to consider whether amendments are needed to better balance the right to collective bargaining with the need to protect the national economic interest. Now, they can also look at addressing the airline competition policy, because the fragility of Canada's aviation network as exposed by this strike underscores the need for greater competition. Policymakers should act on the long-standing recommendations of the Competition Bureau of Canada and independent analysis to review and potentially relax restrictive cabotage and foreign ownership rules. Fostering a more competitive market is the most effective long-term strategy for building a more resilient and consumer-friendly air travel system. As opposed to the broader aviation industry, let's take a look at a few of the recommendations that could be brought in for them. They could proactively address systemic labor issues, such as the unpaid work grievance at the heart of this dispute. It's not unique to Air Canada and is emerging as a central theme in cabin crew negotiations across North America. Airlines should proactively move away from the outdated block-hour pay model and develop a modern compensation structure that fairly remunerates employees for all required on-duty time. Addressing this issue proactively can prevent future costly labor disputes. They can also enhance the system-wide operational resilience. The shutdown should be treated as a critical case study for the entire industry. Airlines, airports, and air navigation service providers should collaborate to improve system-wide contingency plans for large-scale disruptions. Key areas for improvement include inter-carrier communication and cooperation protocols, standardized passenger information systems, and more effective resource management during crises. They can also look at rebuilding the passenger trust. Following the resolution of the strike, Air Canada will face the significant challenge of rebuilding trust with its customers. Many travelers will have been severely inconvenienced and may feel that the airline was not transparent about their rights regarding compensation and rebooking. A comprehensive and sincere public relations and customer service campaign, potentially including goodwill gestures beyond regulatory requirements, will be necessary to repair the damage done to the airline's brand and reputation. With that, folks, you've been listening in to another live chat with James here at the studios at ProPix TV in Metro Vancouver. We will keep you apprised of all indications and any announcements that come from Air Canada and the QP offices as the strike looms just hours from now. Once again, you've been watching live chat with James on ProPix TV. Don't forget to leave your comments below and like, follow, and subscribe as it helps grow our channel. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and safe travels.